Hello, everyone. Just going to give it another minute or so to let the rest of the people join, and then we'll get started. Okay, well, let's get started for this evening. So, first of all, thank you for joining us tonight. Again, I'm Michelle Boyce. Most of you probably know me by now. And I'm going to be the presenter tonight on our final webinar of 2025 and bringing the end to our series, which is the legacy phase of planning. Right? So typically I try to go over quickly the disclaimer, but tonight I think this is pretty important. I want everyone to realize this is for educational purposes only. I am not an attorney, even though we're going to talk a lot about some legal things. Um, all of at the end, there'll be another disclaimer, like any of the legal conversations all need to be, from an attorney to have legal advice. This is not tax advice, but a lot of this stuff is pretty straightforward and things that we see often in planning, especially when it comes to the legacy phase. So just a quick little reminder of your RFS team, Mickey, Stewart, and myself. And as I said, I am going to be your presenter for this evening. So just a few housekeeping items. It is being recorded, so if you have to jump off early, you can find it on our website, or if you're viewing it after the fact, thank you for taking the time to view the recording this evening. Okay, so getting into the meat and potatoes of the presentation, right? So we've been talking about the different phases of someone's financial life. Our first webinar of the year back in Q1 talked about the accumulation phase of someone's life. When you're starting to work, you're in those accumulation years, you're saving, you're doing what we call climbing up that financial mountain with the goal to get to the top, which that top is retirement. Right? Now, once we get to the top of the mountain or we get to that retirement age, then we start the descend down the mountain, or what I call is the distribution phase of life. And that was the second webinar that we had this year that I talked about. And that's really my specialty when working with clients is you've now accumulated your wealth. How do we then distribute it throughout retirement? Right? As part of the distribution conversation, it goes into that last phase, which is legacy. Okay. And that is what we're going to speak about tonight. Some of the common pitfalls that we see with legacy planning, the best assets to leave versus the worst assets to leave. Okay. So if you think of this as a continuous flow, right, that's what we wanted to get across with our webinar series this year, the different phases of someone's financial life, because you will be in one of these phases currently, and then you will be in a different phase in probably 10, 15 years. So as much education as you can have, the better decisions that you can make. So you saw this slide in our last webinar if you were on it, and it talks about the role of someone's wealth in retirement, right? And I have the same conversation when I'm having a first call with a client and talking about, you're getting ready to retire, you've accumulated this pile of money. What does it need to do for you, right? It needs to do 4 different things. The first thing is that it needs to provide a stream of income, right? Because you've been the stream of income for the last 20, 30 years through going to work every day, getting a paycheck. Now your assets need to be what is going to provide that stream of income for you. So that's the first thing it needs to do. The second thing that it has to do is that stream of income has to last forever. And the problem with forever is that it's unknown. Your forever could be 10 years, it could be 40 years, and everyone's forever is different, which is one of the variables that makes retirement planning much harder than accumulation planning because there is an endpoint. You know when you are going to stop working, right? It might be a year or 2 off, but that's very different when we're talking about how long we need it to last in retirement. The third role is that those first 2 have to occur under a variety of contingencies, which just is a fancy way of saying what could happen in the future. Your income still has to come to you, which means if tax rates are higher, you still need your income. If there's a market decline, you still need your income. If inflation is at double digits, you still need your income. There's a long-term care event for you or your spouse, the other needs the income, right? So a variety of contingencies that we have to plan for. And then the last is the money that's left has to provide a legacy. Now, legacy can be a word that means many different things to many different people. Oftentimes, if someone says legacy, they're like, I'm not worried about, making my children rich, right? They're doing well, they're professionals, they're earning good income, right? And that's not what I mean by legacy, right? Everyone has a different definition. And if your goal is to leave a significant sum to your children, that's great. If it's not, that's also great. But the reality is you will leave some sort of legacy. That legacy could be $100, $100,000, or $100 million, right? Everyone's circumstance is different. But what is true is that your legacy will go to one of these 6 places. It's either going to go to the government in the form of taxes. It's going to go to other wealthy people, right? So if you haven't done the right planning, oftentimes other wealthy people can come in and take advantage of that. I'm sure you've all seen an estate sale, right? Posted online, or they used to be in the paper. You drive by a nice house and you see that they're selling the things inside of it. And that's usually because the family needs some sort of liquidity event. So they're selling that property so that they can generate those funds. It can go to financial institutions, right? In the form of fees or surrender charges or cost to be able to get the money out of certain things. It could go to corporations like nursing homes, right? Or skilled living facilities. Or it could go to charity or your friends and family. So in my 21 years of working with clients, when we go over this list, 99% of the time, if they have their choice, right, they want their money to go to either charity, friends, or family versus those first 4 options, right? So again, your legacy will go somewhere. The question is, do you want to go to Uncle Sam or do you want to go to your children, right? Or your favorite charity? So what we're going to spend some time on now is talking about the government, right? And how does your legacy end up with Uncle Sam, right? The uncle that you never wanted. And here's how. The simple way is in the form of taxes, right? Everyone's least favorite word, right? But what do I mean by taxes, right? Well, your estate or your legacy, right, could end up being taxed numerous ways. It could be taxed from probate, which we're going to talk about. What is probate? We're going to talk about estate tax, federal estate tax, and then also state estate tax, which I'm sure I will mess that up saying because it doesn't roll off the tongue. And then the last tax that people often forget is income tax. And I'm going to show you how that actually could be one of the largest taxes that your legacy ends up paying if planning isn't done correctly. Right. So first, let's talk about probate, right? The way that I've set up tonight for these several different taxes is kind of talk about what is it, right? So probate, why does it happen, right? So basically what probate is, it's the legal process to distribute your assets from your estate, right? Pretty simple term, but why does it happen? Why does someone's estate go into probate? And the reason is that those assets are not directly passed to a beneficiary, so they end up in your estate. And your estate has to be settled and closed, and that has to happen, right, by legally, right? That has to legally happen through the courts. So what does it cost? So that's the second part of how the format's going to go. First is, why does it happen? Second is, what does it cost? So what does probate cost? Well, there's court filing fees, right? So that's different across the size of your estate, different states, right? It costs attorney fees. You need an attorney to help settle your estate with that probate, which on average is 3 to 5% of the estate value. Okay. Oftentimes, you have an executor who's working with the attorneys to get this accomplished. And then if they have a fee, right, you pay for the executor fees, right? So there's numerous fees here and what it costs. But honestly, I think the biggest cost is the time. Probate is a long process and a timely process, right? So I did a quick, just kind of Google of the average of how long probate takes, which is anywhere between 6 months to 24 months after an estate has been kind of, after someone passes and now their state needs to get settled. It, every state is different. I know in Florida, for example, it takes a long time. The courts are very backed up, right? So if you're waiting for that money to come in, your beneficiary is waiting for that money to come in and they're not getting it for 24 months and they could have gotten it, right, and needed it for something. We don't know what the cost is for that. Right? So that is what it costs. And then the third way that we're going to structure this is what are some ways to prevent it? Right? Probate can actually be prevented pretty easily. And if you work with an attorney, they are going to set you up that way, right? And it's proper planning, simple ways, beneficiary designations. Any accounts that you can add a beneficiary to, add it so that it doesn't go to your estate, and make sure you're adding a contingent beneficiary. A big mistake that we see is that we have spouses listed as primary beneficiaries, and then they don't list a contingent. And then when one spouse passes, it goes to the other, and they don't think about setting up, right? Oh, well, who's going to be my beneficiary now, right? Or if they both pass closely together and no contingent is listed, right? So that's an easy fix. Another easy fix is ownership of accounts, right? If you're married, make sure that you own those accounts jointly. If both names are on there. That way, when one spouse passes, the other still has 100% ownership, and then they can change the ownership or list a beneficiary. The use of trust, you know, having the trust own or having the trust the beneficiary has it go directly through the trust versus going into your estate and being part of probate. Right? Or you can gift your assets out, right? So that way, any assets that were going to end up in probate before that happens, right, before your demise, you can gift those assets away to get them out of your estate. Right? So those are all just simple techniques that are often overlooked, but can save you anywhere from 3 to 5% of your estate value, plus everything else I mentioned that goes in probate. So that's kind of tax number one, right? Which people don't look at as a tax, but it's definitely a cost. Number two, state estate tax, okay? So why does it happen? Well, it happens because you live and then you die in one of the 12 states that has this tax on your estate, right? And you're over the exemption, right? So 12 states in the United States have a state estate tax. I could not say that 3 times fast, right? But they all have different thresholds of when that estate tax kicks in. There's no uniformity, right? So here's an example. I know we have a lot of New York clients. In New York, the threshold is 7.16 million currently, right? The threshold in Illinois, because I have several clients in Illinois as well, their threshold is 4 million, right? So your state over 4 million gets triggered by the state estate tax. Okay. What does it cost? Well, because there's no uniformity, it depends on the state. It depends on the size of your estate and how large the exemption is, right? New York, for example, it's a cliff tax, right? So if you have a certain percentage, once you get over that 7.16, they have a little bit of a calculation of how much you're over, but your entire estate is subject to the estate tax, right? Where Illinois, you get that 4 million exemption. If your estate's worth 8 million, well, then you're only getting taxed on 4, right? So every state is different, which is why you have to work with an attorney that is familiar with that state. Ways to prevent it. Easiest way is to move to a state and die in a state that does not have a state estate tax, okay? But that's easier said than done, right? Especially if you lived your whole life in one area, you have family there, you have grandchildren there, right? You're not just going to pick up and move. Okay? So again, it goes back to proper legal planning. Okay? You can set up trusts. Those trusts can remove your assets out of your estate. Now, there's also a look back period in a lot of this planning when you're using trust to get things out of your estate. So this isn't something that you can wait to the very end of life to do. You should be doing this sooner than later if you think you're going to have that problem. You can gift assets out of your estate to your children to get below that threshold. Right? You can use the portability. Some states allow you to have portability between each spouse. Right? Or you, instead of gifting to friends, family, you could gift to different charities, right? The point here is that you need to do the planning to get yourself below those thresholds, right? Or if step one, know that if you're at that threshold, know if you live in a state that has an estate tax. I'm surprised sometimes when we're meeting with clients that they don't realize the state they live in has this type of tax and that their estate would be triggered. Oftentimes they think of it in relative of the federal estate tax, which has a much larger exemption. And they're like, well, my state's not large enough. I only have 5 million, 6 million, right? But in some states, like Illinois, for example, that would trigger a tax, right? So another way to prevent it is to educate yourself. Find out the rules for your state. So I mentioned federal estate tax, right? Well, let's talk about that. So been a big topic of discussion this last year, right? The big beautiful bill. We weren't sure what was going to happen with the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. The exemption was set to sunset. Now it's been extended. Okay, so why does it happen? Why is an estate tax triggered? And the reason is because your taxable estate goes over the threshold, right? So the threshold currently is 13.6 million per person, which is 27.22 million for a married couple. And that is slated to have a cost of living adjustment each year. So that keeps growing and growing. And currently there's no legislation to say that that is going to end. Just because it's not currently written doesn't mean that it won't be written in the future though. All right. So that is why a federal estate tax happens. What does it cost? Well, it can cost up to 40% of the amount of your estate above the exemption, right? So let's say you have an estate that's 40 million, right? Your exemption's easy numbers 27, right? So that's what, a $13 million above the exemption. That 13 million was what would be subject to the 40% estate tax. Okay? Ways to prevent it. I think you're starting to see a theme, the proper planning, right? If you want to pay 40%, don't do planning. If you don't want to, this is where you need to do the types of planning to get assets out of your estate or have that money sitting somewhere that you can pay it that's not part of your estate, right? So again, this is where we use a lot of trust work, right? Different trust here. Simple trust to remove assets. You can do generation skipping trust, right? Attorneys have all sorts of techniques and planning, different ways to trust, depending on your unique situation and what you want to have this money do to design a plan, right? You can gift assets, again, charitable giving. If you want a liquid asset, to help offset some of that tax, owning life insurance is a great way to pay for that tax. Getting it outside of your estate in an ILIT, which is an irrevocable life insurance trust, right? That doesn't count as part of your overall estate, right? So you could have $100 million out in that islet, right? And it's not part of your estate if it's been there long enough, right? So again, these are all planning techniques that if you think you're going to be in that situation where you're going to be subject to the federal estate tax, or you are today, there are ways that you can reduce it, right? Income tax, right? So, like I said, the topic that doesn't get talked about as much when you're thinking of legacy, but it's what I am seeing more and more and more with our clients, right? Due to the large federal exemption, not as many clients are subject to that, right? And unless you live in the state, one of the 12 states with the state estate tax, we don't see that as often either. But a majority of the clients we work with have this problem right here. They have large IRA balances, right? And then as part of legacy, they're going to get left to their children, right? Which triggers a very, very large income tax brought to you from the Secure Act. Because the Secure Act eliminated the stretch IRA and said you now have to deplete any retirement plans, IRAs, 401ks, any tax deferred buckets over a maximum of 10 years, or what we call the 10-year rule. Okay. So what does that cost? Well, again, it depends. It depends on the amount that's getting inherited, right? It depends on who's inheriting it. Okay. But if that person inheriting it is in their working years, right, and earning a large income, all of that money is now being added to their income, and now they're paying an additional tax. Okay? Ways to prevent it. Well, you can do Roth conversions during your life. That's paying the tax up front. Excuse me. Sorry, I thought, okay, back. I thought I was going to sneeze. You're doing Roth conversions during your life, right? That's a way to prevent this. You pay the tax up front, but now all of those dollars compound tax free. With a Roth, you still have to deplete it over 10 years, but you're not paying tax on those distributions like you are with qualified dollars, right? Or a tax deferred dollars. Another way is that you can spend down the IRAs during your life versus just taking the required minimum distributions, which is most people's plan. They only take the RMDs each year, and then this is how they get in a situation where they have a large tax left for their children or the person who's inheriting that. So I'm going to switch screens and I'm going to show you a real life example of this, right? Of what the problem is and then a way to prevent it. Okay. So let's say we have someone who's 65, right? And their age horizon is 90, right? We're just picking a point in the future. And they have $1 million in a qualified plan. And let's say it earns 6% and they're in the 25% bracket. Their plan is that they're only going to take the RMD because they don't want to pay taxes on that distribution any sooner than they need to, which is a very common theme that I hear from clients after client. Like, I don't want to pay the tax. I don't need these dollars. I want to keep deferring it. Okay? So in that instance, we start with $1 million. It continues to grow from 65 till 73 here, when in this example, the RMD would kick in, right? That million now goes to 1.6 million. So you thought you had an RMD problem at $1 million. Now you have an even larger problem at 1.6 million. So in year one, you have to take your RMD, which is 60,000. You pay the tax on it. You're left with 45. Year after year, you do that. Your RMD gets larger and larger each year because your account balance actually continues to grow and compound. Because if it's earning 6%, and you're only taking out in those early years 3.5, 4, 4.5, right? There's an arbitrage there, which has your account growing. So in this instance, right, 83, from 73 to 83, your account actually grew. So your RMD just kept getting larger and larger. By the time you get to age 90, right, you've paid 433,000 in tax, but there's still 1.6 million left inside that IRA. And that's what is part of your estate now. Okay. So if you're subject to state estate tax, that value counts. If you're subject to federal estate tax, that value counts, has to be in your estate. But you're absolutely now subjecting your children or who's ever inheriting this, it's not a spouse, to income tax. So they have to take that over 10 years. Let's say they earn that same 6%. They earn a 25% tax bracket. Now they have to make these gross distributions each year of the RMD and then empty it out in the last year, which is $900,000 they have to take out. So during their 10-year period, they pay $569,000 in tax on top of the $400,000 that you paid during your life. So this software does a great job of taking accumulation of that. That's over $1 million of tax paid on that $1 million asset that you went into retirement with and said, hey, I don't really need this money. I'm just going to let it defer. I'll leave it for my kids, right? Yes, the kids still get a significant value, but Uncle Sam got a significant value along the way as well. Right? So how to prevent that? So what if you didn't just take the RMD each year, right? What if instead you calculated that you would pay this down during your life, right? So rather than being that 1.6 million left at the end of your life, there's zero left, right? So you take 72,000 a year. Oh, sorry, gotta put the tax in, right? You take 72,000 a year, you pay the tax each year. You pay 470,000 of tax during your life, but there's zero left in this account to go to the children. Okay. So let's just talk about taxes first. You basically pay the same amount during your life, right, that you were going to pay anyway. What, another $30,000, $40,000, right? I could manipulate that it was the same, right? But you saved almost 670,000 of tax for the kids. Okay? But you might be saying, well, wait a minute, but they don't have $1.7 million now. Right? Well, what if you didn't touch another asset? Because you had more money coming off the IRA, maybe you had a brokerage account that you didn't have to take money from now. And that continued to grow. And that now leaves 1.7 million. And they get a step up in basis in that, which is a much more tax efficient asset to leave. Or what if you took this 54,000 a year and used that to buy life insurance so that when you pass, they get a tax-free death benefit from the life insurance. Again, a much more efficient asset. Right? So there's other ways to skin the cat is what I'm trying to show you here if you think outside the box. Right? Because the worst asset now to leave is qualified dollars. All right, so let me go back to my other screen here. Okay. So talked about how money gets to the government, right? Those 4 different ways. It's taxes, but broken down into different types of taxes. Now, what are ways that you can leave your legacy to your family, your friends, or your favorite charity? Okay. So I was just touching on this, right? Leave the right assets to them, right? If you're going to leave a legacy and it's something that's important to you, do the upfront work to figure out what should I be leaving and what should I not leave? Because some assets are the right assets compared to others. Example, life insurance, right? That gets tax-free, income tax-free to your beneficiaries. And if owned properly, Federal estate tax free, right? Roth IRAs, as I stated earlier, they're still subject to the 10-year rule, but they're tax free. So pulling that money out doesn't hurt your children, right? It's a tax free distribution. Brokerage accounts, right? You get a step up in basis of non qualified dollars. Here's what I mean by that. Let's say you bought, keep it very simple. Let's say you bought NVIDIA when it was $5 a share, right? And now it's worth $1 million. And you've never sold any of that NVIDIA position because you didn't want to trigger the capital gains. When you pass, that account's now worth, $1 million. That goes to your children. They get a step up in basis on the day of death. So their basis is now that account value of $1 million. So they could then sell without having to trigger any capital gains, or they could hold it, let it grow to say 1.2 million, cash out the whole thing and only have a $200,000 capital gain, right? Very different, much more tax efficient than those IRA dollars. The use of trust, right? Avoid probate. Put your real estate inside a trust. Put those accounts that do not pass by beneficiary inside a trust, right? That way they're getting to your beneficiaries with quicker and without having to go through probate. Also, consider charitable strategies, right? If giving to charity is something that's important to you, right? Think about how you want that legacy to be. And a legacy with charity can be during your life or after. Right? We've seen a large uptick in some of these strategies, like donor advised funds. Okay, so a donor advised fund has a lot of great attributes where you get a tax deduction for putting that money in. All of that money you put in, you get a tax deduction for. And then you have complete control over who you give that money to and how much you give it to over a period of time, right? See a lot of clients that like this because it's simple. It's simple to set up, right? It's easy to then keep that ongoing. It gives you the ability to give today, in the future, or later. Okay. Another charitable strategy we use is a charitable remainder trust, where you put money into a charitable trust today for a period of years or for your life. You take income during that, so you're getting use of those dollars. You get an upfront tax deduction, and then at your death, whatever the remainder value is goes to charity. Right? So you can use that as part of your planning today for a future gift. Charitable lead trust is kind of the opposite. You put money into that today. The income that comes out goes directly to the charity. And at the end of the term, you get the remainder value back into your estate. So it's a way to give to charity today and also get some tax benefits. Another way is qualified charitable distributions, what we call QCDs, which come directly from your retirement account. So if you do not want that RMD can go directly to a charity, never hits your tax return, and you don't have to pay the taxes on it. Right? So there's all different ways that you can be more tax efficient in your gifting and what assets you want to provide a legacy with. So where do you start, right? So the first thing is that you really should sit down with your family and your spouse, determine your goals. What's important for you and your legacy? What do you want to be remembered for today and in the future, right? Are there causes that are close to you? Do you want to benefit generation 2, or do you want to benefit generation 3, 4, and 5, right? Every situation is different, but you should have a real conversation about that and determine your goals. You should review your simple thing here, review your beneficiary designations and your account ownership, right? That should be something you're doing on an ongoing yearly basis anyway, making sure that things are set up correctly, that in that event that you're no longer here, you have that passing the cleanest method as it possibly can. Third step, you should work with a financial professional as well as legal professionals who understand, number one, what your goals are, and it can help you achieve them, right? So it's knowledge is power, right? So you knowing what you want to achieve and then taking those goals to the professionals that have the knowledge of how the tax laws work, the attorneys that know how the trusts work, how the legal parameters, how probate, how all of that works, bringing them all together so that you can create a plan to achieve those goals. This one tends to have a little controversy around it, but more and more studies are showing, right? Communicate your goals with your family. Tell them the type of planning you have done. Right? For a long time, finances have always been taboo, right? We don't talk about it. We don't necessarily share those plans with the next generation. And we're finding that not sharing creates a lot of confusion, sometimes jealousy, some fighting, right? It causes a lot of shifts in family dynamics versus if the patriarchy of the family, right, tells everyone, this is what I want to have happen. Here's the planning that I've done, right? It Everyone's on the same page at that point. It makes it easier to implement. And then down the road, they all remember that conversation and say, mom and dad really wanted it this way. And then the last step, don't wait, right? Start this now, right? There's always different planning that you can do at different phases of your life, from the accumulation to the distribution, right? But if you are in that distribution phase, especially that later portion, right? You should make sure all your ducks are in a row, right? It's no time like the present. We know what tax laws are today. We know what the rules are, right? You have to play by the rules of the game. We are in some of the most favorable estate legacy type of tax that we've been in a long time, right? So use that to your advantage. And there's a legal term that's called use it or lose it, right? And a lot of times with that unified credit, it's like that, right? So work with professionals, ask us questions. If you don't have an attorney, we know a lot of attorneys that we can refer you to that are professionals. And so again, I hope you found tonight very educational. I also hope you found all of the webinar series in 2025 educational, right? That you're seeing those different phases and how they all tie together. And it's really one continuous ride up the mountain, ride down the mountain, and then off into the sunset. So we thank you for your time. At this time, I'll see if there's any questions in the chat that I will help answer. All right. It doesn't look like anyone has any questions this evening. Again, I thank you all. Have a wonderful night, and we will see you in 2026.